What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the defensive linemen set to hit free agency in the CFL in 2023. And one thing I'll say right off the bat is that there is so much depth at this position when you look at the guys that are available in free agency that we're going to go a little bit more in depth with the guys that are not in the top fives that you see on the board here. So we're just going to get right into it right now. And just like I did for the offensive lineman, I've split it up into two categories because there's two kind of different positions with defensive line, as people that follow football know. I've separated into edge players, so those are the defensive ends / outside linebackers, and the interior guys, more of the defensive tackle type. So starting with the edge players, at number one, I still have to go with Ja'Gared Davis of the Toronto Argonauts. Little bit of a down year in terms of production last year, but certainly still a big part of that Toronto Argonauts core that was able to win the championship last season. Famously has made the Grey Cup in every single CFL season that he's played in, and won his second Grey Cup this past season with Toronto. So I think with that championship pedigree, the pedigree for playing well at the right times of year, just the consistency that Ja'Gared Davis brings to the table, I have to put him at number one on this list. In terms of a destination for him, I put Toronto and Hamilton as potential destinations for Ja'Gared Davis. I think that Hamilton will probably try to bring him back, given the impact that he had on that rivalry this past season. And I think that, Toronto will wisely want to keep him. But at the end of the day, I think he's going to be one of the highest paid defensive ends again in the league next season. And, going forward, I think he's still one of the best players in the CFL in general. Now moving on to number two on the list, we have Folarin Aramalati of the Calgary Stampeders, a guy who had a breakout season of sorts last season with the Stampeders. And he's a guy, when you look at his sack numbers, not the most impressive things in the world. 6 sacks on the season, I believe he had last year, but one of the leaders in pressures around the league. I believe he was top 3 in pressures in the league last season, which are really a big indicator of future success, because you're not always going to get to the quarterback, but if you consistently can get there and rattle him, I think that is much more telling of a sign. And he had a great season last year in Calgary and really helped the next guy on this list, Sean Lemon, really produce a lot of sacks as a result. So I think that Oral Malati will be paid as a result of his production last season, and those pressure totals. I think teams will look deep into the tape and see the impact that he had last season with the Stampeders. I don't see him leaving Calgary because he's been there for quite a while. I think he was there since like 2018, that 2018 Grey Cup winning team. Battled injuries along the way until his breakout season last year. So I think Calgary will reward him for the hard work he's done, and he'll stay a Stampeder. Then at number 3 on the list, we have Sean Lemon of the Calgary Stampeders, who was a finalist for Defensive Player of the Year, the West Division finalist, lost out to Lorenzo Malden in the Defensive Player of the Year vote overall, but amazing season last year from Sean Lemon, a veteran of the CFL, almost 100 career sacks, I do believe, and just one of the quietly most productive pass rushers in the CFL on a year-to-year basis. But most famously, he just hasn't really stuck anywhere for a long time in his CFL career. He's bounced around from team to team, and I'm not too sure if he's going to be able to stay in Calgary. I don't know if they're going to be able to keep both of these guys this offseason. So if I was going to choose one of them to leave, it would be Sean Lemon. A destination I have for him is Montreal. I think Montreal could really use that, dominant edge rusher, and I really don't think they currently have that premier guy on the roster. They could use a little bit more production on the edge there. So I put him as a destination, Montreal as a destination for Lemon, but again, I could see him going back to Calgary. I just don't know if the money's going to work out. This is a scenario where you'd like to know where the salary cap numbers are with the CFL right now, and how much salary cap space each team has, but regardless, that's going down the rabbit hole there. But moving on to number 4 on the list, we have Pete Robertson of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. This is a guy that started out really, really hot last season. I believe halfway through the season, he was probably the favorite for Defensive Player of the Year, and then kind of tailed off as Saskatchewan's season faded away last season. And I think that, going forward, he is going to be a guy that is going to be really paid by the market because I believe he's a lot younger than a lot of guys on this list. And the production over his first couple of CFL seasons has been immense. And I think that, going forward, I don't know if he's going to stay in Saskatchewan because of the interest that he's going to generate elsewhere. Saskatchewan kind of doing a little bit of a retool, rebuild, whatever you want to call it, jettisoning a lot of that core. And I think that a team that would be very interested in bringing him in is Edmonton. Obviously they just brought in AC Leonard, another former Saskatchewan Rough Rider, but I think Chris Jones always looking to add more to that defense that really struggled last season. Ottawa could really use a premier edge rusher to pair with Lorenzo Malden, but I think that a number of teams around the league will look for Pete Robertson. And then at number 5, a lot of guys that are honorable mentions here that I considered. But I went with Ubum Gwacham of the BC Lions, who I think is probably the most pure edge rusher left on the board. And I think that, maybe he was a little bit quieter this past season, but in 2021, I was really impressed with him overall. And I think that, going forward, he's a decent candidate to have better production than he did this past season. Again, I think he's more of that pass rushing type. Obviously, that is more valuable in the CFL, more of a passing league. So I think Gwacham is going to garner a lot of attention elsewhere around the league if he does not stay in BC. Again, I put Edmonton as a potential fit here. Again, I know they signed AC Leonard this week very quickly after his release from Saskatchewan, but I do think that's still a spot where they would look to add a second defensive end to that core. And then in terms of the edge players that didn't make my top 5, there are a lot of them. So Thomas Costigan of the Montreal Alouettes, a player I really like, has a little bit of that inside-out versatility. I could have put him over here with the interior guys, but came over in a trade last year from Edmonton and made a decent impact down the stretch with Montreal. I'm sure they would love to keep him. But don't know if that will be the case. I'm sure he'll have a lot of interest from around the league. Kwaku Boateng, a Canadian defensive end for the Ottawa Redblacks, unfortunately suffered an injury in training camp last season, missed the entire year, but I think when he is healthy, he's the best Canadian edge player in the league. Praise Martin Aguike, a very interesting player for the Ottawa Redblacks, who's flashed potential in a handful of games. But I don't know if there's an opportunity for him to continue to advance his career in Ottawa. Would be an interesting fit elsewhere, I think. Shane Ray of the Toronto Argos has battled some injuries over his first couple CFL seasons. But when he's been on the field, he has shown an ability to produce. Malik Carney of the Hamilton Tiger Cats quietly had around 7 or 8 sacks last year, had that big game against Winnipeg where he sacked Zach Collaros a couple of times. He'll be an interesting fit for some other team if Hamilton does not re-sign him, but I think Hamilton's a little thin at that defensive end position, so I think Hamilton will likely be the destination for him still. Julian Hauser for Hamilton, a very versatile defensive end, great athlete, can use him on special teams, can drop him into coverage, but maybe not a number 1 pass rusher for a CFL defense, but certainly a really good number 2. Hamilton may want to retain him as well, but I don't think they're going to bring back both Carney and Hauser at this rate because I think they're trying to raise the upside of that unit. Keon Adams of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, a guy that started out hot a couple years ago with Saskatchewan, but then was released midway through last season, ended up with Winnipeg. I still like the potential there, but it's all about the opportunity going forward. Charleston Hughes of the Saskatchewan Roughriders, one of the best pass rushers we've ever seen in the CFL, but I think this may be the end of the line here. Don't know if he has a spot in the CFL next season. Stephen Banks of the Calgary Stampeders had a handful of really productive games over the past couple of seasons, but not really a full-time guy. Hasn't really proved himself as that full-time guy, I should say. And then, I think that's actually the end of the list here, but a lot of interesting defensive ends available this year in free agency in the CFL. Now moving on to my top 5 interior defensive linemen here. I have Anthony Lanier of the Saskatchewan Roughriders. Very productive year last year before he went down to injury. I think he was one of the leading candidates for Defensive Player of the Year before he went down to injuries. One of the leaders in pressures in the entire league, regardless of edge or interior guys, which is really impressive for an interior guy to be up there in terms of leaders and pressures. I think that he is going to be one of the most sought after players in free agency. Keep in mind Winnipeg as a potential destination for him. Winnipeg and Saskatchewan, sometimes they like to go back and forth, steal free agents off each other. I think this would be a great move for Winnipeg if they have the cap space to bring him in. Maybe they don't, but like I said, we don't know. Number 2, I have Micah Johnson of the Hamilton Tiger Cats. He is kind of missed a free agency. He's kind of bounced around the league the past several seasons. Spent the last year in Hamilton, obviously, but I do see him probably changing teams. I think he had a decent year last year in Hamilton. He's still a brick wall as a run stopper. Can produce a little bit as a pass rusher as well, but just not the same guy he used to be in that regard. But I do think he'll have a lot of interest around the league just because he is such a great run blocker, run stopper, I should say. And I think Saskatchewan is a potential fit for him if they lose Lanier. But again, I think there's a lot of interest around the league for Micah Johnson and the experience that he brings to the table at that defensive tackle position. And then at number 3, I have Casey Sales of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. A younger player that has produced a good amount of statistics over the first couple seasons in the league. Maybe he looks for more money elsewhere if Winnipeg cannot provide that for him, or if Winnipeg looks to upgrade that position by bringing in a guy like Lanier. But I think that Edmonton is a potential team that could look out for to bring him in, because I think Edmonton really struggled in terms of the interior defensive line. Stopping the run in particular was a big issue for Edmonton last season. So I think Edmonton would be one of the leading suitors for Sales this offseason. And at number 4, I have Ted Laurent, Canadian defensive tackle for the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Spent basically his entire career with Hamilton, getting up there in age. He's kind of an ageless wonder kind of guy. I think he's like 35 years old. So I think if he plays another CFL season, I think it is with Hamilton. I don't think he's going to go elsewhere. Maybe he goes back to Montreal, where I think he's originally from Montreal or has some connection to the province of Quebec. I may be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure I read that once. But Ted Laurent, not going to provide a bunch of pass rush ability at this point of his career, but a really solid run stopper, one of the best run stoppers in the entire league. And then at number 5, like a lot of these lists I've done so far, could have went a lot of different ways, but I went with a guy that I think has a lot of good potential still, and that's Tim Bonner of the Edmonton Elks, a guy that was released by BC midway through last season, but landed in Edmonton. And I think that he showed a little bit of flashes his first couple of CFL seasons. And Edmonton, like I said, is thin at that defensive tackle position. So if they can't bring in a guy like Sales, or maybe they keep Bonner and they bring in Sales, I think they're so thin there that they could sign multiple guys to try to fill that role, beef up that defensive line. And I think Bonner could be a good fit there. Now, in terms of interior defensive linemen that aren't in my top 5 here, there are some interesting names here. So you have Vincent Desjardins, a Canadian defensive tackle for the Montreal Alouettes. Hasn't really gotten the opportunity to start too much in the CFL, but has been a rotational guy for the Stampeders and Alouettes. Probably still a Montreal Alouettes come next season. Michael Wakefield of the Ottawa Redblacks can move a little bit outside as well to play some edge. Just a good depth off defensive lineman to play in your defense, but not really a star per se. Davon Coleman, a very high floor defensive tackle that will produce around a handful of sacks a year. You just know what you're going to get from him, but not necessarily a star. Fabian Foote for the Toronto Argonauts, another Canadian here, a McMaster product that has hung around in the league, just a good rotational guy to keep on the roster. McConnell Henry, another Canadian here for the Edmonton Elks, guy that's getting up there in age. Maybe he doesn't play next season, but I think there'll be a market for him just because of that Canadian status, more of that run stuffing type defensive tackle, not going to provide much from a pass rushing perspective. And the last guy here is S.A. Marabure of the Edmonton Elks, who was a former first-round pick, I do believe, but hasn't really lived up to that expectations in his career. But those are just the names that are available in free agency on the defensive line. I think there's a lot of depth in this free agent class at this position, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see what guys land early in free agency, and then seeing how these guys that are, a little bit on the fringe, do they find teams still? Because, there might just be a situation where there's just too many of these guys available teams maybe pinch pennies a little bit, don't want to pay up. And it'll be a very interesting market to watch this offseason. But with that said, you guys will just have to let me know what you think down in the comments section. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.